The winter Harlem wind had a way of testing a man's posture long before another man ever tried. It swept through Lenox Avenue like a silent examiner, tugging at coat collars, carrying the distant notes of a trumpet, and brushing against the brick buildings that had witnessed more resilience than any marble courthouse downtown ever would. In 1933, Harlem was not merely a neighborhood. It was a living argument. It argued for dignity in a country that often denied it. It argued for culture in rooms where culture was appropriated, but not respected. And on that particular night, beneath the amber glow of street lamps and the hum of a restless city, one man walked with the composure of someone who understood that dignity was not negotiable. Ellsworth. Bumpy Johnson did not hurry when he walked. He did not need to. His pace was deliberate, his posture straight, his gaze calm but observant. Those who knew him well understood that his quiet was not emptiness, it was calculation. He read rooms the way scholars read poetry. He weighed words before speaking them. And perhaps most importantly, he never mistook noise for authority. Harlem had already begun to see him not as a spectacle, but as a steward, a man who believed that even in complicated circumstances, there was a line that must not be crossed. Inside the Renaissance ballroom, a gathering was underway that did not belong to Harlem, though it was hosted within its walls. Politicians from downtown, businessmen with polished shoes and colder intentions, and men whose reputations traveled ahead of them had assembled under crystal chandeliers that sparkled like false promises. The invitation had been framed as partnership, but everyone present understood the underlying message: control. Dutch Schultz had arrived with that message wrapped in confidence. He was charismatic, ambitious, and accustomed to shaping outcomes through intimidation disguised as negotiation. To him, Harlem was an opportunity, profitable, vibrant, and in his mind, manageable. The first hour of the evening unfolded with civility. Drinks were poured, cigars were lit, deals were hinted at, but not yet spoken aloud. Bumpy stood near the far end of the room, speaking softly with a community leader whose church roof needed repairs. He listened more than he spoke, nodding occasionally, promising nothing but offering assurance that fairness would be considered before profit. It was in these small exchanges that his authority was most visible, not declared, but demonstrated. When Dutch finally approached, the air shifted in subtle ways. Conversations quieted. Laughter dulled. The orchestra, sensing tension beyond melody, softened its tempo. Dutch smiled in the way a man smiles when he believes he is about to win something. "Mr. Johnson," he began, extending a hand not as an equal but as a test. Bumpy accepted it calmly, meeting his gaze without aggression and without submission. It was a handshake that lasted half a second longer than comfort allowed. Their conversation began with formalities, but beneath every word lay territory. Dutch spoke of expansion, of efficiency, of modernizing operations. He used polished language to describe systems that would shift profits downtown while leaving Harlem with crumbs disguised as opportunity. When Bumpy responded, his voice was steady and measured. He did not accuse. He did not provoke. He simply asked questions that exposed imbalance. "And how," he inquired gently, "does this arrangement protect the families who built this place?" It was not a challenge. It was a reminder. Dutch's smile thinned. The room grew attentive. He was accustomed to resistance delivered through anger, because anger could be dismissed. But calm scrutiny was more difficult to overpower. A comment slipped from his mouth, careless, laced with prejudice that reflected the era's ugliest assumptions. It was not shouted, but it was sharp enough to cut. A few men near the bar shifted uncomfortably. Others pretended not to hear. Harlem had endured worse insults, but endurance did not make them harmless. Bumpy did not react immediately. He adjusted his cufflinks. He took a slow breath. And then he said, "Respect is not a courtesy reserved for certain neighborhoods." His tone remained even, but the words carried weight. They did not attack, they clarified. Dutch stepped closer, lowering his voice in a way meant to intimidate. He spoke of power, of influence, of what happened to men who complicated progress. It was a warning disguised as advice. For a brief moment, the distance between them narrowed not only physically, but symbolically. The ballroom seemed to shrink around their exchange. 400 eyes measured the outcome. Some anticipated violence. Others hoped for it, believing it would confirm their biases. Instead, Bumpy did something unexpected. He stepped back half a pace, not retreating, but creating space. And in that space, he invited the room to witness restraint. "You mistake cooperation for weakness," he said quietly. "They are not the same." The statement hung in the air like a verdict. Dutch, unsettled by the absence of fear, reached for dominance in the only language he trusted: force. He gripped Bumpy's lapel, pulling him forward in a gesture meant to humiliate rather than harm. Gasps echoed against crystal. The orchestra stopped playing entirely, but what followed was not chaos. It was clarity. Bumpy removed Dutch's hand with deliberate firmness, not striking, not escalating, simply reclaiming his space. His composure remained intact, his breathing steady, his eyes unwavering. In that instant, the narrative shifted. The crowd had expected an eruption. They received discipline. They had expected retaliation. They witnessed self-command. Silence descended heavier than any shout could have. Dutch's face flushed, not from injury, but from exposure. He had attempted to reduce a man to spectacle, and had instead revealed his own insecurity. Bumpy adjusted his jacket, straightened his tie, and addressed the room rather than his aggressor. "We can build something here," he said calmly. "Or we can destroy what others have built before us. The choice will define us more than tonight's tension ever could." It was not a threat. It was an invitation to accountability. Several men lowered their gazes. One older businessman cleared his throat, stepping forward to propose that discussions continue with civility. The power in the room had shifted without a single punch thrown. Dutch, recognizing the tide, forced a tight smile and retreated toward the bar, where he busied himself with a drink he did not taste. As the evening resumed its fragile rhythm, something irreversible had occurred. Bumpy had not won through dominance. He had won through dignity. And Harlem, watching from balconies, from doorways, from whispered conversations the next morning, understood that strength did not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it arrived quietly, refused to bow, and left a room forever changed. The winter wind carried the story faster than newspapers ever could. It moved through brownstone windows, into barbershops and jazz clubs, into kitchens where mothers stirred soup and fathers spoke in hushed tones about possibility. They spoke not of violence, but of composure, not of spectacle, but of self-respect. And somewhere downtown, Dutch Schultz stared at his reflection in a mirror that no longer reassured him. For the first time, he understood that Harlem was not merely territory. It was conviction. And conviction, when embodied by a man who would not bow, could not be bought. Harlem did not sleep after the Renaissance ballroom incident. It listened. It listened to the rhythm of rumors traveling through barbershops and beauty parlors, through church pews and pool halls, through jazz clubs where trumpets cried truths that newspapers would never print. The winter air carried more than cold. That week, it carried expectation. The balance had shifted ever so slightly, and men who once felt invincible now felt watched, not by police, not by rivals, but by conscience. Bumpy Johnson understood something that few men in power ever truly grasped. Dignity, once demonstrated publicly, becomes contagious. It spreads quietly, altering posture and tone. And that frightened those who depended on fear to maintain control. Dutch Schultz had not forgotten the ballroom. He had replayed the moment in his mind, the grip, the resistance, the silence that followed, and what unsettled him most was not that he had been challenged, but that he had been outclassed without a single dramatic blow. Pride does not heal easily when exposed before witnesses. Within days, pressure began to build in subtle, calculated ways. Business owners in Harlem found themselves approached with revised offers. Licenses were delayed. Shipments were mysteriously slowed. A quiet squeeze, precise and surgical, designed to remind the neighborhood that influence could travel both north and south of 110th Street. It was not open warfare. It was intimidation wrapped in paperwork. Bumpy did not respond with retaliation. He responded with presence. He visited store owners personally, walking into establishments not with guards, but with calm assurance. He listened. He asked questions. He assured them that no man should ever feel alone in his own community. And while he never promised miracles, he promised effort, and in Harlem, effort backed by integrity was worth more than threats. The deeper conflict did not erupt in the streets. It formed behind closed doors in a private supper gathering, arranged by a mutual associate who believed reconciliation was still possible. The location was deliberate, a grand Manhattan townhouse far from Harlem's pulse, with oil paintings on the walls and a dining table long enough to suggest importance. The invitation list was small this time, no orchestra, no crowd, just a handful of influential men in two figures who represented two visions of power. Dutch arrived early, his confidence carefully reconstructed. He greeted guests with laughter that carried a hint of edge. When Bumpy entered, the room did not gasp as it had in the ballroom. Instead, it stilled. He wore a dark overcoat and removed it slowly, handing it to a servant with polite gratitude. He nodded to each man at the table, his courtesy neither exaggerated nor submissive. It was the manner of someone who believed that civility was strength. Dinner began with forced lightness. Silverware clinked against porcelain. Conversations hovered around markets and politics. But tension does not vanish simply because it is ignored. It thickens like steam rising from untouched plates. Eventually, Dutch leaned back in his chair and addressed the table with a smile too deliberate to be genuine. "We're all here because cooperation benefits everyone," he said. "But cooperation requires clarity about who leads." The words were carefully chosen. Leadership in that room meant control. Control meant hierarchy. And hierarchy, in the 1930s, was too often defined by prejudice masquerading as order. Bumpy placed his napkin beside his plate before responding. He did not rush. He did not raise his voice. "Leadership," he replied evenly, "is not about who stands at the head of the table. It's about who ensures everyone at the table can eat." The line was simple, but it cut through the pretense. One of the older businessmen shifted in his seat, studying Bumpy with new respect. Dutch's jaw tightened. He had expected confrontation. He had prepared for aggression. What he faced instead was philosophy, and philosophy cannot be bullied. So he changed tactics. He spoke of law enforcement pressure, of federal attention, of how easily certain communities could become collateral damage in larger battles. It was not a direct threat, but it carried implication. The suggestion that Harlem's peace was fragile and dependent on compliance hung heavy in the room. For a brief moment, the stakes crystallized. This was no longer about pride. It was about protection. About whether a community would be squeezed into submission or shielded through negotiation. Bumpy felt the weight of that responsibility in his chest, but it did not bend him. It anchored him. He leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "You can apply pressure," he said. "You can tighten every screw you find. But understand this, fear does not build loyalty. It builds resentment, and resentment does not stay quiet forever." His eyes did not waver from Dutch's. The room felt smaller. The men present realized they were witnessing not a dispute, but a crossroads. One path led to escalating intimidation. The other led to a new understanding of mutual respect. Dutch, in a final attempt to regain dominance, stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He stepped toward Bumpy, close enough that breath mingled. The gesture was meant to recreate the ballroom, to provoke, to ignite. For a fraction of a second, the room braced for violence. But Bumpy did not rise. He remained seated, composed, his hands resting calmly on the table. And then he did something more powerful than any physical retaliation could have been. He turned his head slightly and addressed the other men at the table. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "ask yourselves which example you want associated with your names, intimidation or integrity." It was not defiance directed at Dutch. It was accountability directed at the witnesses. Silence fell heavier than before. One of the businessmen cleared his throat and gently suggested that discussions continue without theatrics. Another murmured, "Agreement." Dutch looked around and realized that the audience he had hoped would validate him was no longer certain. In that instant, the true turning point occurred. Bumpy stood slowly, meeting Dutch's eyes not with hostility, but with resolve. "We can coexist," he said softly, "but we will not be cornered." The words carried no threat, only certainty. Dutch stepped back first. It was a subtle movement, almost imperceptible, but everyone saw it. Dinner resumed, though the food had gone cold. Agreements were not signed that night. Deals were not finalized. But something far more significant had shifted. The narrative of dominance had cracked. Harlem was no longer merely territory to be managed. It was represented by a man who refused humiliation without resorting to chaos. When Bumpy stepped out into the night air, snow had begun to fall in delicate silence. Each flake seemed to soften the city's edges. He paused on the townhouse steps, breathing deeply, aware that the battle ahead was far from over. Dutch Schultz was not a man who surrendered easily. Pride wounded can become unpredictable. Yet as Bumpy descended those steps, he did so with an unshaken calm. He understood that power built on respect outlasts power built on fear. And Harlem, watching from afar, felt something stir, not rebellion but reassurance. The conflict had deepened, stakes had risen. The quiet war of dignity versus dominance had entered a new phase. And though no blood had been shed, the emotional battlefield was more intense than ever. Because now it was clear, this was not about territory. It was about what kind of men history would remember. And history, as it always does, was listening. By the time spring reached Harlem, the city no longer whispered. It watched. The snow had melted into dark gutters and shining streets, carrying away the silence of winter and replacing it with something heavier, anticipation. Harlem was alive with movement again, but beneath the music and the laughter, a quiet awareness had taken root. Something had changed, not loudly, not violently, but decisively. Men who once spoke carelessly now measured their words. Doors that had been slammed shut before were opening just a crack. And all of it traced back to a man who had proven that power did not have to snarl to be felt. Bumpy Johnson had not celebrated the small victories. He never did. Celebration invited complacency, and complacency invited mistakes. Instead, he observed. He listened. He understood that when pressure fails to break a man, it often shifts form. Dutch Schultz had retreated publicly, but retreat was not surrender. It was recalibration. The escalation came quietly, the way storms often do, not with thunder, but with a sudden stillness that unsettles birds before rain ever falls. Businesses that had once been left alone now faced inspections. A respected community organizer found himself questioned downtown for reasons no one could clearly explain. A charitable fundraiser lost its permit at the last moment. None of it pointed directly to Dutch, but the pattern was unmistakable. This was punishment disguised as process. Cruelty masked as order. Bumpy felt the weight of it in every conversation he had with shopkeepers and elders. They did not accuse. They did not demand. They simply looked at him with eyes that asked the question he had been expecting. How far can dignity go when the system itself turns against you? He never answered immediately. He believed in choosing words the way a man chooses where to plant his feet, carefully, knowing the ground beneath him mattered. "We don't panic," he would say quietly, "and we don't become what we're being pushed to become." It was not reassurance for its own sake. It was strategy. The real confrontation arrived not in Harlem, but far from it, in a downtown hearing room where the walls were paneled in dark wood and justice often wore the face of convenience. The summons was official, formal, and intentionally intimidating. Several Harlem representatives were called in to clarify associations, a phrase vague enough to mean whatever those in power wanted it to mean. Dutch would not be present. Of course, men like him rarely appeared where fingerprints could be left behind. But his influence filled the room before anyone ever spoke. Bumpy entered the building alone. He did not bring lawyers to sit beside him in theatrical defense. He did not bring allies to crowd the benches. He walked through the metal doors with the same composure he carried into ballrooms and boardrooms alike. He removed his hat respectfully. He nodded to the clerk. Small gestures, often overlooked, but never wasted. The room was full of men who believed authority came from title rather than conduct. They shuffled papers, whispered among themselves, and studied Bumpy as though he were an object to be categorized rather than a man to be understood. Questions came layered with insinuation. Associations were implied. Intentions were questioned. Each inquiry was designed not to uncover truth, but to provoke defensiveness. Bumpy did not take the bait. He answered plainly, calmly, without embellishment or apology. He did not deny Harlem's struggles, nor did he exaggerate his own role. When asked about influence, he spoke of responsibility. When pressed about control, he spoke of accountability. And when one official, emboldened by the imbalance of power, leaned forward and asked whether he believed he was above his station, the room leaned in with him. Bumpy paused, not long enough to seem evasive, long enough to be deliberate. "I believe," he said evenly, "that a man's station is defined by how he treats those with less power than himself." The words did not echo. They did not need to. They settled. One of the clerks lowered his eyes. Another official shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The tension thickened. This was not the script they had prepared for. They had expected anger. They had expected fear. They had expected a man desperate to defend himself. What they faced instead was someone who refused to perform weakness. Outside the hearing room, word spread quickly, not of accusations, of composure, of restraint, of a man who had walked into a system stacked against him and left it unsettled by nothing. More than clarity and calm. Harlem absorbed the news like a deep breath. Dutch Schultz, however, felt something far less steady. For the first time, the methods he trusted were not producing the outcomes he relied on. Pressure was not cracking. Resolve, intimidation was not shrinking influence. Worse still, others were watching, not with admiration for his power, but with curiosity about Bumpy's restraint. Curiosity was dangerous. It led to comparison. And comparison rarely favored men who ruled through fear. The breaking point came at a private gathering meant to restore Dutch's dominance. It was smaller than the ballroom, louder than the townhouse dinner, and filled with men eager to witness. A show of strength. Bumpy had not planned to attend. He had been invited not as an equal, but as a test, a calculated attempt, to provoke a reaction that could finally be used against him. He arrived anyway. The room froze just slightly when he entered, the way a crowd does when it realizes the story may not unfold as expected. Dutch stood near the center, holding court, his voice animated, his gestures sharp. He spotted Bumpy and smiled, not with warmth, but with challenge. This time the insults were more direct, less polished. Words meant to reduce, to provoke, to ignite anger in front of witnesses who leaned forward, hungry for collapse. It was the most dangerous kind of moment, not because of physical threat, but because of expectation. The room wanted Bumpy to break. They wanted proof that dignity was a performance, not a principle. Bumpy listened. He did not interrupt. He did not react. He waited until Dutch finished speaking, and the silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Then, instead of responding to the insult, he addressed the room. "You're watching closely," he said calmly, "so let me make this easy for you." He turned slightly, allowing everyone to see his face. "You can decide tonight whether you respect a man who needs to humiliate others to feel powerful, or one who doesn't." The words landed like a weight dropped into still water. No shouting followed. No confrontation. Something far more devastating occurred. Men looked away from Dutch, one by one. Some pretended to sip drinks. Others adjusted jackets. The room had made its decision without announcing it. Dutch felt it immediately. Power, he realized too late, depends on witnesses who believe in it. And belief, once shaken, does not return easily. Bumpy did not stay to savor the moment. He never did. He adjusted his coat, nodded once to the room, and walked out. The door closed behind him without ceremony. Inside, the noise resumed, but it rang hollow, like laughter after a verdict. Outside, Harlem waited. And for the first time, the question was no longer whether Bumpy Johnson could withstand the pressure. The question was how long those who relied on intimidation could survive being exposed by nothing more than integrity. By the time summer settled over Harlem, the air felt different. Not lighter, not safer. Just aware, the kind of awareness that settles over a neighborhood when history begins shifting in quiet increments. The kind that makes men straighten their shoulders and women pause at open windows, just a moment longer. The tension that had built through winter and spring had not erupted into chaos. It had evolved into something more difficult to fight. Clarity. Dutch Schultz had spent months attempting to reclaim the narrative. Pressure, intimidation, legal maneuvering, public posturing. None of it had restored what he lost the night a room chose dignity over spectacle. He was still powerful, still wealthy, still connected. But power that requires constant proving becomes fragile, and fragility breeds desperation. Final confrontation was not planned. It began with a rumor that swept through Harlem just before dusk. A sudden announcement that several businesses would be seized under questionable technicalities. The timing was deliberate. The message clear. Compliance would have been easier. Crowds gathered along Lenox Avenue. Not shouting, not rioting, just watching. Shop owners stood in doorways with folded arms. Elders leaned on canes. Young men who had grown up hearing whispers about pride and posture now felt those lessons pressing against their chests. And at the center of that stillness, Bumpy Johnson walked. He did not stride like a general marching toward battle. He walked like a steward heading toward responsibility. His hat tilted slightly against the sun, his expression calm. Those who saw him did not cheer. They simply stepped aside, forming a quiet corridor of expectation. Across the street, officials stood beside marked vehicles, clipboards in hand. They avoided eye contact with the crowd. They were not villains. They were instruments. And instruments, when directed poorly, can cause harm without understanding the music they're playing. Dutch arrived shortly after, stepping from a polished car with calculated timing. He wore confidence like armor, but his eyes carried strain. This was meant to be the final demonstration. The reminder that Harlem's defiance had limits. The two men stood facing each other in open daylight. No chandeliers. No banquet tables. No closed doors. Just Harlem watching. Dutch spoke first, loud enough for the crowd to hear. He spoke of order, of contracts, of consequences for those who challenged structure. His words were polished but sharp. Each sentence framed as inevitability. Bumpy listened without interruption. And then, instead of stepping toward Dutch, he turned toward the shop owners. That movement alone unsettled the script. He walked to the nearest storefront, a modest grocery, owned by a family that had worked there for decades. He placed his hand gently against the doorframe, not possessively, but protectively. Then he addressed the officials, not Dutch. "If there is a legitimate violation," he said evenly, "we will correct it. If there is paperwork missing, we will supply it. But we will not be punished for standing upright." His voice did not rise. It didn't need to. Dutch stepped forward, frustration cracking through his composure. "You think words protect you?" he asked, the edge finally visible. Bumpy met his gaze without hostility. "No," he replied calmly. "Community does." The statement seemed simple, but its effect was seismic. One by one, shopkeepers stepped forward from their doorways, not aggressively, not shouting, just standing beside him. An old woman placed her hand on the arm of a young man beside her. A minister removed his hat. Even a few of the officials shifted, suddenly aware that they were no longer facing a single individual, but a unified presence. Dutch had expected confrontation. He had prepared for resistance that could be labeled disorder. What he faced instead was solidarity without violence, dignity without threat. The turning point did not come through force. It came through stillness. An elderly man from the crowd, someone who had once been silent during earlier humiliations, stepped forward and addressed Dutch directly. "Sir," he said quietly, "you mistake patience for fear." The words were not rehearsed. They were not grand. But they echoed. Dutch looked around, searching for validation in faces that no longer offered it. The officials, sensing the shift, began reviewing their documents more carefully. One of them cleared his throat and announced that further review would be required before any closures could proceed. The crowd did not cheer. They exhaled. Dutch stood in the middle of Lenox Avenue, the sun no longer warming his confidence. He understood what had happened, not defeat, not in the traditional sense. Something worse. He had been outgrown. Bumpy stepped closer, but not confrontationally. Just near enough to speak privately while the crowd watched respectfully. "This never had to be about pride," Bumpy said softly. "It could have been about partnership." For a moment, brief but real, Dutch's expression shifted. Beneath the ambition and ego was something human. A flicker of realization. That strength demonstrated through intimidation eventually isolates the one wielding it. He said nothing in response. He simply turned and walked back toward his car. No dramatic music, no shouting, no physical collapse. Just the quiet understanding that an era of control had encountered an immovable principle. As the vehicles pulled away, Harlem remained standing. The shops did not close that day. The crowd dispersed slowly, respectfully. Mothers returned to kitchens. Musicians returned to instruments. Children resumed play in side streets. But something fundamental had been restored. Not dominance. Dignity. That evening, Bumpy walked alone through the neighborhood. The sky burned orange against brownstone rooftops. A young boy ran past him and paused, looking up with curiosity rather than fear. "Did you win?" the boy asked. Bumpy considered the question carefully. "No," he said gently. "We remembered who we are." The boy nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense. In the weeks that followed, Dutch Schultz's influence began to unravel, not because of one dramatic confrontation, but because belief in his inevitability had weakened. Investors grew cautious. Associates reconsidered loyalties. When fear loses credibility, it loses currency. Harlem, meanwhile, did not erupt in celebration. It matured. Conversations shifted from survival to possibility, from endurance to direction. And Bumpy Johnson remained what he had always been, composed, intelligent, quietly authoritative. He did not declare victory. He did not claim credit. He continued walking the streets with the same deliberate pace, aware that leadership is not a single moment, but a sustained example.